Hello, I'm Dr. LaChance, and I'd like to welcome you to the first in a series of 8 talks on my most recent book, The Modern Christian Mystic. And because many of you have been with me before in an earlier exploration of these ideas called The Modern Christian Mystic 1, I've set up a few basic ideas as a kind of bridge from the earlier talks to this one, at which point, when I complete these, we'll all have something of an introduction into at least some of the ideas that we'll be talking about in the book. From time to time, you'll also hear my grandson, Jonah, contributing to the lectures. He's down here. You can't see him, but you'll hear him. So, first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the fact that the book actually begins with an introduction, a biographical introduction on my part, which includes the exploration of some rather significant abuses that I and many other people suffered at the hands of the Christian church. And from my tradition, which is Catholicism, the fire of my introduction has been kind of stolen by Pope Benedict XVI recently in his talk to the world on television during his visit to the United States regarding the abuse issues. And in that talk, he genuinely apologized, and it was my experience and the experience of many other people that it was sincere. And so I'm not going to spend any time from the introduction of the book talking about that, because at this point, for me, the healing has been experiential and real. And I genuinely experience an interior forgiveness of all that happened to me at the hands of a distorted form of Christianity. However, having said that, this book and several to follow will be my attempt to rid the Christian experience of those distortions that have come down through time, through history, and in a book that will be coming out in 2009 on the Gospel of John, and another one after that called The Modern Starets, which is a Russian Orthodox name for guru in the Christian tradition. Those books will be offering a kind of reviewing, viewing of the whole Christian experience as experiential and mystical, which in my opinion, in the opinion of several other Christian mystics, was in fact the original intent of Jesus of Nazareth, who never actually separated himself from Judaism. So, to start off, I want to just talk a little bit, I want to introduce you to some of my thinking that will be further amplified in the book as we begin to talk about it. So the first is on this chart, the evolution of the self. And there are 4 levels in the evolution of the self. The zero fulcrum, I'll use Ken Wilber's terms, the zero fulcrum would take place from conception to birth, during which time the child in utero would be experiencing some signaling from the mother's body, both within her body, the signaling of her body, in other words, the drumming of the heart, the rhythm of the breath, and so forth, as well as whatever's happening in her environment with regard to the family or workplace or place of worship or wherever else she happens to be. And while I don't really know much about computer technology, early on I remember discs used to have to be formatted. And that experience in utero is a kind of formatting. There is a certain predisposition set up with regards to expectation of the post-birth environment. So then comes birth to the growth of the adult, which is the formation of an ego. And the ego is the first person singular in Greek of the verb to be, ego, I am. And typically, by the time the person has reached a young adult stage, there has either been a religious experience through a tradition in the family, it might be Christian or Buddhist or whatever it might be, but there should be some familiarity, or the person will have begun to look for something for his or her own self as the soul begins to find a language to describe itself. And I've called that period the spiritualized ego. And frequently it's involved with the gathering of the understanding in terms of a religion. And the reason that there is this dotted line above it is because in the experience of many people, that's where growth stops at the spiritual level. The person moves from an individual ego, I am, to an ecclesial ego, we are, and begins to define him or herself as a Catholic or as a Mahayana Buddhist or as a Muslim or whatever it might be, and frequently stops right there. And that's the great tragedy, the great weakness that creates the tragedy that is so often attendant to religion, is it just becomes another kind of ego. We, the in-group, who has the truth and knows what God is, are against those, the out-group, them, who don't know. And we're now at a place in the evolution of the human where it's no longer possible for us to survive interculturally with that frame of reference. We have to find the ability to understand something more fundamental that is present in each of the religions. And I call that transcultural subjectivity or intercultural subjectivity. What happens if the person at this stage really does hear the truth of whatever religion they're involved in? They begin to understand that the breakup of the ego, both individual and collective, must happen if the next stage in spiritual growth is to take place. And I call that the sunrise of the soul. And the sunrise of the soul is the breakdown of the ego in order for the soul to, in a sense, be downloaded and replace or displace the personality with the presence of the soul. And so what happens is we begin to meet the real person as the ego breaks down, both in its individual and collective phases. As that continues to go on, and the evolution following the sunrise of the self continues, at some point there is a genuine awakening to a unitive self. And the unitive self is the place where we must move in order to be able to begin to understand ourselves in our true being, rather than in our egoic being. So that is the first. So the evolution is simple. Zero. The zero fulcrum is conception to birth. The first fulcrum is birth to adult ego. The second is the spiritual ego, or the religious ego, which, if they take this teachings seriously, in other words, have someone to teach them what the teachings mean, they then go through a crisis and break through into the sunrise of the soul, and then ultimately awakening to the unitive self. The second of these four-part graphs I'm calling the four voices of the soul, and the four voices of the self. The first three being what I call the brain mind. And the brain mind, because the brain is triunal, because it has a cognitive cortex, an affective cortex, the limbic system, and an instinctual cortex, the brainstem, the three voices together form the brain mind. The fourth voice is the emergence of the soul, which takes place in, sadly, very few people, because there are so few teachers, especially in the West, who are able to help the student to be able to transcend the brain mind and enter into the still small voice, which I'm calling the fourth voice, which is the voice of the soul. And in Christian iconography, that is indicated by the halo, the first of these. So what this very crude drawing down here is if we could think of everything below the chart as pre-space and pre-time, then as space and time emerge, they actually emerge through the brainstem. The brainstem represents an early form of the evolution of life forms. And that is then there are a whole series of minds that the person, the student or the spiritual pilgrim can emerge through until they're in fact thinking with the mind of the entire universe. We hear in St. Paul, put on the mind of Christ, which I've always thought of as the perfectly wrong language to describe this. It's more evolve into the mind of Christ or realize the mind of Christ. The Buddhists have a saying from the Lotus Sutra, Na Myoho Renge Kyo, which means that the soul of the universe, which for our purposes will be this outer edge, and my soul is the same soul. And that's the emergence of the fourth voice and all the subsequent voices that follow. Until we've transcended the brain mind, we only know about God. We may know a lot about God, but we only know about God. It's in the fourth voice that we begin to know God. And that, sadly, is an experience that bypasses too many people because, again, the teacher is not there or the student is not willing to be taught how to arrive at that universal fourth voice mind, which, of course, is the mind of God, or in Buddhism, mind, in Hinduism, Brahman, in Taoism and Confucius, the Tao, and so on and so forth.
Question?
We hadn't planned that, but you can, I suppose.
Well, I think it would be useful to leave that for 1 second. In order to differentiate, so a person trying to accomplish this can know what the fourth voice is. Maybe you could talk just very briefly about what the brain mind sounds like, so that because we all know what it sounds like once you've said it out loud.
Why don't you do that?
Well, in other words, if we're
just come up.
Okay. I think what you're saying, anyway, what I understand is if you're hearing, that on a day-to-day level we have three different voices that are going all the time, even if we're not aware of them. So at an instinctual level, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm tired. At an affective level, I'm sad, I'm happy. And at a cognitive level, even something as mundane as thinking about your errands for the day, or, I'm trying to understand complex theology, but that all of these, we get so caught up in these that we don't even realize that the minds are talking. And it's only this fourth voice, when we're able to step back, like in Buddhism they call it, the mind of the observer, being able to observe these three, that we suddenly realize that there is something else going on, that we can step back into something larger. I just thought it was worth it.
And of course, that's all true. And the way that that's done, which again is not taught often enough in a Western context, is through meditation. A long-term daily discipline of real meditation in order that the brain mind might quiet down and the fourth voice begin to be heard. And until all the chatter, the Buddhists call this chatter up here of the brain mind, the monkeys in the trees. The quieting down of all of that enables the possibility of the universal voice to be heard, which is the only place that we can build a transcultural or intercultural understanding of one another, when we have all of the various cultural names for the fourth voice and a unified discipline way to get there. So down here, what we're looking at, all of these should be permeable. these lines. They should all be broken. And I'll talk about why further on. But if we can imagine then this being totally unitive with pre-space and pre-time, in other words, the mind of the divine, then that is what is emergent through the whole four voices, and ultimately is the voice of the soul, which is the fourth voice. And you can stay up here if you want to continue to comment. It's fine with me. I'm happy with you doing that. So there are also 4 genetic levels, and the levels that the genetic code is responsible of could be named propagation, because everything that has ever lived emerges from the same genetic code. It's staggering to think about that we possess within us the genetic instructions for the dinosaur, for instance. We possess within us the genetic, the resultant genes that emerge from the evolution from unicellular life all the way up through the reptilian, into the basal mammal, the higher mammals, the primates, and up into the human. We possess all of that because everything is propagated by instruction from the code. But even more wonderfully, there's another level to the code, which is the ecological governance of all of that. So not only is all of that produced in its multiform splendor, but it is then has another level of governance, of balance, that is also the code. And as if that's not enough, the cultural animal, the human, also emerges as yet another level of that code. So wherever there are humans, there will always be culture, because culture is really just an agreement about how things will be done. Shall we eat pasta, or shall we eat vegetarian, or shall we be meat eaters, whatever it might be? How shall we cook it? What will be the style of the way we celebrate birth, marriage, death, and so on and so forth? And now, where we find ourselves, once again, we find ourselves with this barrier that needs to be permeable so that we can reach the next level. And what is the next level? The next level is the union of cultures by discovering that which makes them sentient interculturally and at the subjective level, the interiority of culture, in order to build a world culture that is, number one, able to affirm and allow the governance of the code among the animals, and to allow them to propagate. So this unitive level is really a gathering of these three and transcendence into another understanding. And the blueprint for that, because we too are governed by the code, the blueprint for that is all within our sacred scriptures, whether Buddhist, Hindu, Taoist, Confucian, Native, or Abrahamic. The instructions are all there. However, those instructions have to be heard in a way that is more transcendent or more transfigured beyond the spiritual ego, the religious ego. In other words, there has to be a new kind of teaching that takes all of this and brings it up to another level that I'm calling the unitive level of the cultural event. So back again to pre-space. We have pre-space and pre-time down here, the mystery that precedes existence, emerging as cosmos, which is emergent as earth, which is then emergent as the life community, propagated, governed, emerging into culture, and ultimately unitive with the whole, a new kind of world culture, which is not a syncretism. It's not the mixing of all the colors to come up with a drab brown, but instead to make all of the colors as vibrant as possible so that their interiority is seen and able to be understood transculturally. And in doing that, we finally begin to develop respect for the cultures and begin to see their signaling, which is also genetic, regarding the governance, propagation, and so forth of the life community. Anything further to add? Okay, so I also want to talk about 4 human propensities. And these propensities are inherent in all of us. And each of us has a different admixture of them based upon our experience of life, based upon our karma, or what we come into this world with as talent or whatever. And in Hinduism, these 4 propensities were distorted and hardened into castes. And that was not the original intention. The original intention was to enable people to begin to be able to understand which of these propensities they are more suited for. So in the first caste, what happened was the political distortion of this from its Vedic roots caused people to claim a kind of birthright to each of these castes and to lock other people out. So, for instance, I'm from the working class. In the United States, so I would be in propensity number 4. And yet, as it turns out, my life has been functioning in the first propensity, which is wisdom. And so it can go the other way. And what happened was, by locking these into castes politically, genuinely creative people who might have been great business people or great soldiers or policemen or those who run society, politicians, are locked out of, and vice versa. Each is cemented into, instead of a permeable barrier, an impermeable barrier that locked people out. So with the advent of people like Gandhi and Ramakrishna and others, and Yogananda especially, I think, what happens is these were broken and made permeable again and are seen instead as propensities. So you have those whose gifts are the realization of the sacred and the teaching of it. You have those who are more adept at being soldierly, or those who would lead politically. You have those who are able to produce wealth and help the poor, and you have those who really are happier working with their hands, working with their bodies. And frequently, this group of people are made to feel inferior in the schools by being disallowed to be seen as equal to those who are on a college prep route instead of a technical route, in terms of like auto mechanics or building, whatever. I mean, I was tested once in all of these categories, and I tested extremely high in wisdom and language, but the woman said, "Mr. LaChance, we don't want to disappoint you, but no one would want to walk through a building that you've designed or built, because they would be taking their lives in their hands." So the understanding of these propensities is that they are all for the service of all. This is my wife, Carol, here, who's busily taking these from me. There are 4 traditions of mysticism. There is the Abrahamic, the Indian, the Chinese, and the tribal. The Abrahamic are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Indian are Hindu and Buddhist, and all the others that come from them, the Jains and so on and so forth. It's not that it's really this simple, but nonetheless, there are 4 traditions of mysticism. And then in the Chinese, there are the Taoist and Confucian traditions. And in the tribal, there is a global tissue of consciousness that functions at that level and gives us the eco-wisdom that we need in order to move forward. These cultures, and I think the mysticism of the Eastern cultures, both Indian and Chinese, presently needs to inform the Abrahamic mysticisms so that we don't continue in our devastation of the planet. And then in terms of this particular series of talks, we're going to be looking a lot at Christianity. So we come down here, and what are the major Christian vehicles? I use the term in the way the Buddhists do in talking about the major traditions within Buddhism, Mahayana, Theravada, and so on, Zen. So the four major Christian vehicles are the Roman Catholic, which was my tradition I came out of, the Orthodox, which my future son-in-law came out of, the Protestant traditions, which is the Reformation, and the evangelical traditions, which kind of thin out and become fundamentalism, which itself is problematic. All forms of fundamentalism are problematic. And in the midst of all of these, you have the emergent U.S., the United States, Episcopal tradition, which presently is in a state of discord with its mother church, the Anglican. And the Episcopal seems to me our best bet in terms of an emergent view of Christianity. They can include the mystical. Why? Because they have the symbolic depth of both Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and they have the freedom of conscience of the Protestant and evangelical traditions, all wrapped up in a tradition that is very, very robust and creative presently in the United States, and that's where my practice presently is in the Episcopal Church, and I have great hope for that tradition carrying forward the new understanding, or the unitive understanding that this whole book and much of my work is about. There are also 4 levels of cultural evolution as a whole, and I've called them, I've actually named them as the emergence of various propensities within the human collectively. I've called them Homo instinctus, Homo affectus, Homo rationalis, and Homo spiritus. And in the Homo instinctus, we're talking about the traditions that were built, I would say, from the brainstem outward, which would be the global tribal level of religious understanding, which is still in permeable relationship with the natural world, draws its efficacy from the natural world, draws its symbolism from the natural world, and hasn't really lost that mysterium tremendum of its interpenetrability with the life systems of the planet, being soil, air, water, and light, the other animals, and so on and so forth. And then the human emerges from the tribal, doesn't leave it, it's still present, but develops a growth edge that I'm calling Homo affectus, which is the religious traditions, all of them, East, West, and so forth. And that, in the West especially, emerged into another level, which I'm calling Homo rationalis, the rational human. And that gives us science and technology. That provides us with the ability for me to talk to all of you out in cyberspace, when if it were left up to me, I would be talking to the 6 people that are actually in this room. And then ultimately Homo spiritus, which is the unitive level. And that's where we have to go. We have to transcend both our tribal instincts, our instincts to lock others out. We have to then be able to understand that that tribal instinct gets locked into our religious ego and remanifests there, and that has to be transcended. We have to get past our strictly rational view of reality that is caught up in science and technology and gives us the ecological difficulties we're having, and emerge into a unitive understanding of ourselves without damage to any of the cultural systems, but instead recognizing the core and the genetic coding that is at the core of all of them, which provides us with the blueprint to move into the future, whether or not the teachers are there in an ordained sense or in hierarchical or an official sense to do it. we have everything we need right here, right here. We have the way to do it here, and we have the goal here, which is Homo Spiritus, the emergence of the human into a larger spiritual understanding. This just needs to be turned. Lastly, I thought today, I came up with these today because I was asking myself, what are the 4 major attributes that are common to all of these series of 4 ideas? And these are what they are. The attributes or dynamisms actually might be a better word. 4 dynamisms. 4 dynamisms. They are all expansive. They are all going from one place to another, and to use Ken Wilber's terms, they all transcend and include themselves. They're cumulative. All of them are cumulative. They accumulate as they go. It's not that every material form is held onto, but instead the wisdom that is within each developmental level is cumulative and leads to another level. They are all permeable. None of them, when they're healthy, forms a barrier. They have boundaries, but no barriers. And so there is a breathing that takes place throughout the natural order. As the air is breathed through, the water is breathed through, the light is breathed through, not only the life community in its animal and plant form, but also in its cultural forms. And they are all eternal and therefore unitive. None of them, because the universe has no real beginning, in other words, what it is a fluctuation in eternity that engenders space-time and energy matter. Everything, all the way back and all the way forward, transcends time and is one. It's all a unitive and permeable, cumulative and expansive phenomenon that we call the universe. So, with these ideas, and it's obvious to me that there's an awful lot said quickly and an awful lot to take in. It might be wise when you're watching this to watch this first one first more than once in order to be able to take in these ideas because they'll be helpful as lenses or a series of lenses through which to view everything that's coming out in the book. So the next little piece that I have a couple pieces I want to deal with before the end of this particular talk, and we have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to cover them quickly. It's not an uncommon observation that the world is cracking up. Everybody has this sense of fear and foreboding regarding the future. This particular day I'm speaking from is in June of 2008 as we look at political uncertainty with regard to the economy. People are starving everywhere in greater numbers because there's a food crisis on the planet in the midst of gluttony. People are suiciding. Addiction is rampant throughout the Western culture. And as we look out, you look up and you say to yourself, my God, am I cracking up? Is it all cracking up? Or are both true? Am I cracking up and it's all cracking up? And it is cracking up. And however, it's the way in which we talk about that that is of the essence. The egg must crack up before the chicken can emerge from the egg. So when reality is shattering, it's because the creativity of life itself is emergent again in a representation of itself that is larger than the egg it's caught in. And it's the same when a woman gives birth. Suddenly, the life within is too big to be contained and literally cracks the woman open and emerges. Now, all of this is a sign of life, not death. Even while it can be frightening, it's important to understand that we're right on the cusp of the emergent unitive period. Homo spiritus is waking up. The cultures are all in touch with each other now. This has only been the case since the last century, the 20th century, where all scriptural traditions are present to all cultures. So now we can look at the core of truth in each of the varying traditions and say, okay, what's there for us now to move together into a unitive future? How do we expand beyond the tribal understandings, the religious egos that we've been caught in, the dominance of cultures through science and technology, the disruption of the life community through pollution that emerges from the industrialized cultures? How now do we move into something new? And so as God responds, and as this emergent vision comes into reality from pre-space and pre-time into space-time and through the cosmos, the earth, the life community, in each of our cultures, what's happening is we have the same experience that must have been the case when the barbarian hordes were just at the edge of Rome. And suddenly the 1,000-year Roman Empire was being threatened with disintegration. And we're in a very similar place. We're in a place that's very frightening. But we really, those of us who really have an understanding of the unitive faith life and are willing to be teachers, are willing to give our lives for the integration of this new understanding and giving it out to others, we aren't really afraid, because we know that this is just the way it is when things change. And that we're moving into a renaissance of such spectacular wonder that it could only, from the Christian point of view, be thought of as the second coming. It could only be thought about that way because, once again, that which we call Christ at the center of Christianity is now emergent in all cultures as Brahman and mind and Tao and so on and so forth. So the second coming is in our midst. This is not the time for Christian people to despair. This is the time for Christian people to be celebratory and to engage their lives, to be the birth canal of this new moment in culture and in the life of the world itself. He so loved the world. He so loved the world. So we're heading toward this new kind of Christianity as well. We're moving from dogmatic Christianity. I know what this is. It's ABC. I believe in God, the Father, the Almighty, the Maker of heaven and earth. All of which is true. It's not that that's not true, but we're moving from the place where we know about how God acts that way to the place where we know God acting that way in our own being and in the lives of each other, in our marriages, in our children, and so on and so forth. This is a wonderful moment, a wonderful opportunity for the young to grab onto what's really happening here and be willing to be risked, broken, and shared in order for that to emerge. So, I mentioned earlier that there are 4 different mystical traditions: the Abrahamic, the Indian, the Chinese, the tribal, and so forth. All mysticism is experiential, and that's what's happening. We're moving from a dogmatic to an experiential form of Christianity, and that Christianity can only be known in the 4th voice. Anything else is knowing about Christianity. We now need to know Christ. And the only way we can know Christ is through the 4th voice. In other words, through meditation, through self-emptying, which the Buddhists call sunyata, it's called confession in the West, and through the miracle of Eucharist. Because in Eucharist, we're eating that which we are. We must form a third millennium Christianity. And that Christianity will amount to conversion of Christianity. And therefore conversion of Christians to Christ's voice in a whole new way. And what that must include are various attributes. One of them, third millennium Christianity must include the deep ecological. We must understand God as the life that is emergent in the planet. We must understand and experience that emergent life within our own bodies, within our families, within our communities, within the life community generally, allowing the animals to live, for they too are divine forms. Number two, it must be culturally unitive. We cannot go on with the idea that we're to turn the cross on its side and have it become a sword through which we go to other cultures, forcing them to see the nature of the sacred in our particular language and in our particular view, from our particular viewpoint. We must address a methodology which leads to the level of consciousness which makes the Gospels literal. This is a key point in all of this. If the level of consciousness that we're understanding the Scripture at is here, and we're calling that which was written from a level of consciousness that's here, we're trying to see it literally, which is what fundamentalism attempts to do, we can never see it right, because the only way it's literal, and it is literal, but the only way that it can be seen as literal is when the consciousness of the reader is at the same place as the consciousness of the writer, or in this case, the gospel narrator, the sutra narrator, the Vedic narrator, the narrator of the Bhagavad Gita, the narrator of the Tao Te Ching. So in Christianity, we need the teacher who will bring us to the level of understanding that reveals the Scripture as literal. Until then, it's silliness, and it's futile, because it doesn't make sense at the level of consciousness that doesn't identify with the level of consciousness that Christ himself had. That, of course, requires a teacher. We must understand, this is another ingredient, the fourth one. We must understand Jesus of Nazareth as guru, rather than to reify him as only Son of God. Is he the only Son of God? Yes. He's the only Son of God in the sense that the consciousness that manifests in enlightenment or awakening is the direct creation, is the Logos of God. It is God's only Son. So when that is made manifest in an individual, they can legitimately say, if it's true, that they're the only Son of God, because there is only one. But in order to get to that understanding, we have to understand Jesus as guru. He was, after all, Oriental or Eastern. He was not born in Chicago or London, either of them. He was born in the Middle East. A guru, from the Sanskrit, means one who dispels the darkness. And this is exactly what John says about him in the prologue to the Gospel of John, that he is the light that the darkness cannot comprehend. So we must understand that Jesus is attempting to give us a way of consciousness, a way to enlightenment, a way to understand why the Scripture is literal, rather than some cognitive attempt at forcing it to be literal when it simply isn't. And lastly, we have to begin to understand ourselves through discipleship versus scholarship. The West has become obsessed with scholarship. And what Jesus is calling for is discipleship. Scholarship can give, nothing wrong with scholarship. We owe a lot to the scholars. They give us everything we know about the Scripture. But they do not give us the ability to access it in our own being. That is what discipleship is about. Scholarship is knowing about God. Discipleship is coming to know God. And so, in the end, what we're talking about is the reemergence of the Christian guru, or starets, S-T-A-R-E-T-Z. And what the starets is the true teacher as over against or opposed to the professor. The professor professes that which we can know about the religious phenomenology, we can know about the comparative religion, we can know all the different things we can know about God and still not know God. I've heard of atheist theologians who make their money through the categories of theology without faith. What we need now is not more to think about, but more to experience in terms of God. And that will be the keystone of the new understanding that will be third millennium Christianity, the reemergence of the Christian guru, the dispeller of darkness. So I'm going to end this particular session, this first session. Are there any questions, just one or two questions, which I'll take right now if anybody has them, and if not, we'll just close this first session, and the next one will be begin with chapter 1. If you're reading along with the book, all of this, it really replaces the introduction to the book in some sense, because the need to talk about the abuse has been transcended through the forgiveness that has been made possible because of Pope Benedict XVI.
Just the one question, something I've heard you talk about before, is what's a Christian missionary in this vision? What's a Christian's role? What's our purpose? What do we do?
We'll get to that further in the book, but for now, what I've tried to do is to turn the notion of missionary on its head to this extent. Too often, the Christian has entered into other cultures with a zeal, a true religious love and longing to baptize. And after all, there was that mission given to us, that commission given to us by Christ, go out and baptize the nations in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That has to be understood in a new way as well. We have to go to other cultures to understand how Christ is present in them, and then come back to our own culture and explain how that is the case. There are statements in the Scriptures such as, I have other sheep that are not of this flock. My Father's house has many mansions. We need to understand that if the Gospel of John, especially its prologue, is true, if out of Christ everything that came to be, then Christ is present in all of the other systems. And our job now, instead of entering in violation of their culture, in other words, violently, we must enter in with a curiosity and a search for the presence of God that will enable us to identify in their culture what it is that we're calling Christ in ours. There are many different names for the word water, but everyone knows how badly we all need water. So in this case, there are many names for God, and what we need now to understand is how to understand God's other names and become brothers and sisters to the Buddhists, to the Hindus, to the Taoists, Confucians, tribal peoples, and so on and so forth. And immediately, in our own family, the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we really must, we have no choice but to find the unitive breath of God because we literally worship from the same tradition of spirituality given to us by Abraham. Okay, so this concludes the very first talk on this subject, and we hope that you'll enjoy it. It will be on the ChristLogos website, which is shared by myself and my partner, Evan Leonard, in order to bring together the spiritual. Evan is a technological wizard, and we're trying to bring together the wizardry of technology and the wizardry of the ages and the aged into a union for the cyber world. So blessings and peace in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.